Welcome everyone to the kickoff of our 2016 Winter-Spring SPED Ahead series, Success for Every Learner from At-Risk to Successful. I'm Clay Whitehead, the co-CEO and co-founder of Presence Learning, sponsor of the SPED Ahead webinars, now in our 4th year with today's program. Presence Learning provides online speech therapy, occupational therapy, and behavioral intervention and mental health services to thousands of schools across the country. Your response to our webinars has been phenomenal. Based on your feedback and requests for expert advice on the challenges you face as leaders in special education, we have now delivered nearly 52,000 hours of professional development to educators and clinicians worldwide. One of your most persistent concerns is finding ways to help every child succeed, including the 3 to 5% of our student population for whom traditional approaches haven't worked. This challenge is now in the spotlight and a national call to action. The federal government just announced ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, the long-awaited update to ESSA. And, believe it or not, this news came just a few weeks after we had decided on the same theme for this webinar series. No, the Fed did not consult us, but we share the recognition that as a nation, we have fallen short in providing resources that every child needs to achieve, including minorities and students with disabilities. And so, we begin this series with one of our nation's leading advocates for inclusion and a tireless champion for children of color and disabilities, Dr. Frances Stetson. We continue in March with Dr. Ed Dunkelblau, one of the founders and most well-respected leaders of the social and emotional learning movement. And we'll wrap up the series in early May with Dr. Ross Green, who will provide an overview of the acclaimed CPS model he developed, which is an excellent example of the type of evidence-based approach that makes success for every learner a reality. Now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Frances Stetson. Thousands of you tuned in for her webinar with us last year entitled 5 Easy Ways to Fail in Education. And we're very excited to have her back to help us answer an important question. Inclusion, is it for every learner? Frances is the president and founder of Stetson & Associates, an educational consulting firm that supports system change in schools. She is one of the most sought-after keynoters at special education conferences. Frances and her staff have helped thousands of school districts learn new ways to deliver high-impact services that help students succeed. She's an expert on differentiated instruction, inclusive practices, and leadership strategies that impact struggling learners. Frances has worked at the federal and state levels and has conducted a range of research on inclusive environments and least restrictive approaches to special education. Before I turn this over, I'd like to point you to a packet of handouts that Frances will ask you to refer to throughout the program. This packet is available in your webinar reminder email, as well as on the left side of your screen right now. And now, let's get started. Over to you, Frances.
Thank you for that warm welcome, Clay. It's always a privilege to work with Presence Learning, and I think these series of webinars are an outstanding example of professional development that's really designed to address the needs within our schools among our educators for the kinds of skill development that we're all needing in being successful for our children. I want to start with a question that's raised by the title slide. Inclusion is for every learner, or is it? Interesting question. When we really look at our data, as we will in just a minute, we're going to see that in spite of all of our efforts at implementing inclusive practices and improving our behavioral strategies and climates and environments in our schools, we still find that we are missing the mark. And so it's important for us to begin today by looking at really the basis for the importance of this topic, and then quickly go directly into some of the data that shows us how far off the mark we are. The point I'd like to make in this introduction is that certainly inclusion and concerns about disproportionality of minority children in special education, and particularly in receiving behavioral services, represent actually an important civil right, the right to belong, and the right to be included rather than excluded. We have evidence that abounds that shows us that we have an increasing set of children who are actually disenfranchised from the school experience. And so the whole sense of the basic concept of the basic, I want to call it a right, but I know that there would be those that would argue with me, but certainly a basic need among children is that to belong, and among adults as well. So to what extent have we created those communities? And then third, as we look at inclusion, certainly over the last 20 years, inclusion has stood, I think, to represent more the concept of least restrictive environment, that it starts with the individual child, and that we make decisions about how we might meet their needs within the general education classroom. To begin with, we'll look at our definition of inclusive practices, and this is from the National Center on Educational Restructuring and Inclusion. Provide all students, including those with significant disabilities, equitable opportunities to receive effective educational services. Now, those are two phrases that are really important. Equitable opportunities and effective educational services. We're going to be looking at that today in my presentation, and looking at the various ways that we have to make certain that it is equitable and it is effective in terms of our actions toward all children, with particularly minority children. So with that said, let's go directly to the concern that we have in terms of the data. That kind of takes us back to, is it for everyone or is it? And I want to take us to two pieces of legislation that were landmarks. Certainly the biggest one was Brown versus Board of Education in '54. And we all know, we cut our teeth on this in our own college preparation programs, that with this sweeping legislation we found that segregated schools are inherently unequal and, as it says, therefore unconstitutional. Yet I want all of you to think for a minute, when you look at your own school or look at schools that you're working within or have a chance to visit, when you look in those schools, do you begin to see some patterns in that school that suggest to you that in fact there continues to be some segregation? And I will speak particularly here when I look at classrooms when we're identifying youngsters with disabilities or that may have a behavioral concern. If you look in those classrooms, our more segregated classrooms for children with a disability, in many of our districts, we will find that the racial or cultural makeup of those classrooms is disproportionate to the general population of the community. And so that we find more of our minority youngsters in more segregated settings. Or do they have, in some cases, not the same level of advantage or opportunity for learning? So Brown v. Board of Education was certainly declared and settled in '54, but it continues to be a concern of ours today, and that's one of the major pieces that we'd like to look at in this webinar. Now, certainly some years later, quite a few years later, but here comes along the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it guaranteed a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. Now we know these, everybody knows this is pretty basic, but I'd like to show you something that should unsettle us just a bit. First of all, when we look at inclusion and children with disabilities being educated with their non-disabled peers to the greatest extent appropriate, there's been an enormous focus on this movement and this process over the last 20 years particularly, if not the last 35 or 40, but certainly in the last 20 years, a real push for more inclusive schools. When we look, we have been working at and on inclusive practices since really 1975 and the passage of the first legislation for children with disabilities. If we look here, one of the things that we notice is that even our inclusion data shows, after all of our efforts, only an 11.6% increase in the percentage of students with disabilities who are educated 80% or more of the day in the general education classroom. Now, we've only seen this increase when we've been collecting this data over the past 9 years, and this has been reported from the annual report to Congress in the latest report. So that's a pretty pitiful increase, given all the effort, all the staffing changes, all the professional development that we're doing across our schools, all the conversations with parents and community about inclusion. Most of our states do not come close to meeting this standard yet, and many, of course, if not most of our districts don't meet this standard either, and so we are off the mark. Now, just hold that thought for a moment and then look at the other statistics. When we're talking about inclusive practices, we've actually seen at one end, of the farthest end of the continuum, a slight increase in the number or percentage of children with disabilities who are being educated in more segregated settings. Let's take that a little further then and look at children of color. Disproportionately, children of color are represented not only in special education programs, but are also subjected to higher rates of exclusionary discipline practices such as suspension and outright expulsion from school. And so when you look at inclusion versus exclusion, this whole issue of disproportionality takes our concern about equity a whole leap forward. We are really looking at inequitable opportunities to learn for youngsters of color who are not only spending less time inside the general education classroom, but they're also spending less time in any more inclusive settings, and so they're more segregated, separated from their typical peers, and really separated in some of the most segregated environments, sometimes even outside of their neighborhood school. We find that disproportionate representation of children with disabilities has over a period of time been really significant. The numbers are high. It's persistent. We haven't shown any progress towards solving the problem, and that includes being pervasively a problem and a challenge that we're all facing. So let's first try to understand why. We really have to go deeper into this question so that we can wrap our arms around the strategies and solutions that we can employ at our schools. As we look at our presentation for today, we have divided it into three basic components. What changes do we have to make in our own attitudes? What changes do we need to make in instructional delivery in the classroom? And finally, and this is, I think, very important, what changes do we need to make not only among ourselves as leaders, but in the systems that our districts and schools have in place that would promote and protect the opportunity for children to be served in less restrictive environments. All right, let's look at our first component, and that's changes in awareness and attitudes. And of course, our thought here is that we have to attend to each of our notions of difference, of diversity, of inclusivity, and look at building an entire strata of educators who are culturally proficient. We have to look at that because that requires us to look at our own thinking and the thoughts of those educators that we work with to be able to investigate further the environments in which our students are learning and the environment between teacher and student that's really particularly important here. Certainly, I think our premise here is very important in that if we don't really pay attention to our own attitudes and our own notions of diversity, differences in classrooms and its value to us, then we're not likely to make the changes in our practice. So attitudes first, then our practices, and then our systems. Now, I love to share this next quotation from Nelson Mandela about the importance of knowing yourself and knowing your own responses to differences in culture. And as Dr. Mandela stated, the first thing is to be honest with yourself. You can never have an impact on society if you have not changed yourselves. Now, I'm going to characterize what I'd like to do in this seminar is address some very difficult issues in a very honest way. If we just stop at that statement, we all nod our heads, we all say, yep, everyone does that, we all feel that way, and yet I challenge us to look more critically at our own practice and the practice of our colleagues and recognize that in many of our schools, when you walk in a classroom, you can very easily tell if there are students that an individual teacher may not feel close to, may not particularly like, and may not be responsive to. And you can tell that in a number of ways. Body language, amount of time devoted to the student, the amount of questions asked that student, and the length of time that we give the student to provide a response. So if we really take on this issue for our schools, and all of us today, I think in our audience are school leaders, the first question has to be, do we have faculties that are culturally proficient? Do we have faculties that really do possess a solid belief that all children have the right and the opportunity to learn? And do we really have those practices that we want to see in place, but embodied within a set of attitudes that are very positive toward all children? So the three issues that we're going to discuss in this first component are the importance of that cultural proficiency. What is cultural proficiency? How important is it in terms of our own practice in the classroom? We're going to look very quickly at white privilege and the notion that we have to look at the equal advantage that all students must have toward learning. Do they have it or do they not? And then lastly, and I think this is important, we have to be aware of the negative impact of the lack of cultural proficiency on children of color and the spiraling effect that this has, I think, on their performance in school and their attitudes through life. So let's begin by looking at cultural proficiency. This is a category that I'm going to spend just a little time on, but I'm going to make a point that I hope we'll all think about as we look at implementation strategies from this session. Our definition says it's a way of being that allows individuals and organizations to interact effectively with people who differ from them. Now, all of you know that we have more and more diversity in our schools. We have a rich cultural diversity. We have linguistic diversity. We have all kinds of different societal differences in poverty, of advantage, and we have certainly studied differences in learning styles and learning approaches, but we now know that these differences that we bring to our role as educator impact significantly how we approach our students and how we interact with them. Ask yourselves as leaders, what is the level of training, of professional development occurring in your own school or in your own district around cultural proficiency? Are we offering quick awareness sessions, 30-minute overviews, an hour on this, a half a day? Are we touching every educator in our school district or in our school? Does everyone possess a deep knowledge of cultural proficiency, the stages of cultural proficiency, and the impact on our learners in the classroom? I am sorry to say that at this point, I look at a lot of catalogs for professional development in districts, and I note that this is usually allotted a small amount of time, and there doesn't seem to be any opportunity for the educators to reflect and discuss. So it kind of slides off just like Teflon. Let's look at the extent to which we are offering really quality professional development in this topic. Now, the authors that introduced it to me, at least, are Lindsay, Robbins, and Terrell. Back in 2003, they wrote an excellent book, Cultural Proficiency, A Manual for School Leaders. Now, they've also updated this book. They've added to it. It's a very excellent resource. And one of the more powerful pieces of their presentation in this book were the 6 stages of cultural proficiency. And as you can see on the screen, they range from the lowest stage of destructiveness all the way to the desired ideal of being culturally proficient. The thing we want to look at in these stages that I think is important is the fact that we want our educators to understand the definitions of each of these and, frankly, to be able to self-diagnose. Where are they? Where am I in that continuum? And what do I need to do in order to move forward in that continuum toward cultural proficiency? And do I also understand as an educator that is not only an important personal goal, but it is an absolutely necessary professional goal to become culturally proficient? Otherwise, I am very likely to make mistakes in the classroom that reflect more negative feelings toward children or offer them fewer opportunities for learning. We're talking about children of color here. So let's look at the 6 stages. And the point to make without defining them very carefully, notice they go from conflict and blame. The bottom 3, destructiveness, incapacity, and blindness, in which there is a negative message sent to children. From destructiveness, we don't want to hear your language spoken in the school at all, to incapacity, because you speak this language as your first language, you are less likely to be successful, to blindness, saying, I really don't notice as an educator any differences in my students in terms of their culture or their language. And so all of those communicate a negative message to youngsters that shut down learning, that create a really challenging learning environment. So what we're really after is, if we're in one of those 3 stages, we need to get with it, we need to understand it, and we need to see the harm that it does to children. And then we need our work in pre-competence, which is just simply realizing what I don't know and knowing how important it is to gain that knowledge all the way up through proficiency. So let's take a quick look at the definition of these terms, and certainly know that we are looking from the bottom part of that continuum. If a student experiences cultural destructiveness, incapacity, or concepts of cultural blindness, they are not as comfortable in their learning environment, because this is more conflictual and it offers blame for behavior on things that are certainly we're not able to change, or the student is not able to change. And it's simply their own cultural or own linguistic differences that another person may, and as you look at destructiveness as a term, negate or speak disparaging of the culture. That is a clear definition of cultural destructiveness, and certainly something that is perhaps, according to Lindsay's continuum, the most destructive. Incapacity, elevating the superiority of your own cultural values and beliefs. You hear that particularly as you listen to children. We're looking at children in poverty and people making assumptions that says, well, you know, if a child is from an impoverished home, they are automatically suspect of having difficulty in learning, and making assumptions about children of incapacity simply on the basis of their own culture or their own practices and beliefs in the home or their community. Cultural blindness is something that I think we hear more and more people talk about, and now we're beginning to hear what we say, and we're hoping to see a great reduction of this. But you've heard people say, well, I see absolutely no difference in any race or culture or language. I think we're all exactly alike. Well, that may have been comforting at some point to someone, but the actual truth is it's really one of the more negative behaviors or practices, because it's acting as if the differences in our cultures don't even exist. And yet what we need to do is that we have to have a real appreciation for the differences. So now, if you'll look at the top three here, pre-competence, competence, and finally proficiency, notice that this begins to be the rich personal journey that enables us to be far more effective as educators. And the first of that last three is the pre-competence. And I really appreciate this. I've actually been in this stage. I remember it well. And that's when you recognize what you don't know. And understanding that what I don't know, as I did, is limiting my ability to be an effective educator, and realizing that I had a number of skills and knowledge and competencies and experiences that I needed to have to be much more comfortable in a multicultural, multilingual world. So this is a good stage, because at least you're uncomfortable now. Let's look at the next definition of competence. Cultural competence, interacting with other cultural groups in ways, now these are important words, that recognize and value their differences. It motivates you, and I've experienced this motivation personally, to assess your own skills, and ultimately it causes you to change some of your own thinking, some of your own behavior, some of your own expectations, and some of your practices in the classroom. I truly believe that the journey from competence to proficiency is one that is constantly moving. Ultimately, I think the difference is very subtle in competence when you read these two definitions, competence and proficiency. But it really is that you're, I believe, over time, very, very comfortable interacting across a variety of cultural groups, and that if, in my own experience, that they feel that the individuals of cultural groups different from my own understand that I am very respectful and appreciative of what they bring to the group and to the equation and to the learning, and that I have a lot to learn from other cultures. Just as I might like to share my own culture with my colleagues, I would also understand that there's equality and importance of those cultures as well. What we really want to move to, in recognizing that there are stages of cultural proficiency, is the notion that we have a lot of work to do in our schools, and the leadership question, what am I doing, what are we doing that build toward cultural proficiency across all my faculty? And I'm going to add another statement. What am I doing as a leader if and when I have a teacher on my faculty or in my district that is less than culturally competent or proficient? What options am I offering them to give them the information needed to move further along that continuum? So a very important leadership question. Now, The second piece that we want to look at is the concept of white privilege, and we're really going to address this very quickly, and I'm going to tell you why. One, I completed a webinar for Presence Learning in the fall of 2015. It actually had a catchy title, 5 Ways to Fail in Education. And one of those ways had to do with the lack of cultural proficiency. So in that seminar, you will find a much more detailed discussion of the whole concept of white privilege and its impact on our learners in the classroom. So for today, I'm simply going to refer you back to the Peggy McIntosh article. In her article, Peggy describes white privilege as an almost invisible, weightless knapsack full of special provisions that white children are born with. I think if you've not read it, it was a very brief article. It's very, very helpful in understanding that there is an even unconscious, unplanned, in many cases, advantage for individuals who are white over those of color in every aspect of our society. And there are some different exercises that you can use with your faculty that's very, very helpful. We want to move on from this, and I hope that you'll have a chance to access either the article or our webinar or both. And we want to look at, I think, really the important piece of this, and that is to say, when we are looking at cultural proficiency or white privilege, the necessary end of that road, I think, for us as educators is for us to confront very honestly and openly that if we are not culturally proficient, and if we do not understand the concept of white privilege, there is a negative impact for children of color, a very negative impact. And this slide just talks about a few of them. Developing feelings of worthlessness, achieving less in school. We have all the data we need for this. Lower aspirations, and a much greater likelihood of dropping out of school. Now, I want you to look at just those 4 characteristics, and I want to pose a question for you. How do these characteristics align with triggers for the behavioral problems we're seeing in school? It's a direct match, isn't it? If we have that cultural bias occurring in our classroom, these are the predictable research-based results for the child of color in our classroom, and then that has a direct link to the triggers for behavioral problems in school. So I think when we're closing up this component 1, we have to realize that if we don't do this work, both personally and in our professional development for our faculty, it will be almost impossible to implement what we're going to talk about next in a real level of fidelity and authenticity. Component 2 is probably one of the more challenging but one of the more interesting pieces of our work in education, and that is what do we change in the classroom in order to get better results for our youngsters in learning and attitudes and behavior. So let's look at a wonderful quotation from Parker Palmer that I really enjoy. Teachers, all educators, in other words, possess the power to create conditions that can help students learn a great deal or keep them from learning much at all. Teaching is the intentional act of creating those conditions. I love the definition. So what do we do intentionally that creates the conditions in our classrooms for all students to be successful? There are conditions and strategies that we must purposely determine that we will use and will use faithfully that do improve significantly the chances and opportunities for learning. Now, just some of those that you know a great deal about already, you've probably been on in many conferences and professional development sessions on differentiated instruction. One thing that's worrying me right now about differentiated instruction is that when I go in the hundreds and hundreds of classrooms I'm in every year, I often will ask teachers and the principal, well, are we differentiating instruction? And the answer is usually we think we are, but when we really look at the instruction that's occurring, we're actually not. We've been to lots of workshops on differentiated instruction, but we still see the same whole group instruction, the same activity, the same way of assessing learning, and so on. So I put it bravely, I put that phrase back up there, differentiated instruction. We need to see it. We need to see it in every classroom so that we will see opportunities for all students instead of, as generally happens, the teacher presenting instruction in the way that he or she is most comfortable with. Scaffolds, opportunities, which we're going to talk more about scaffolding in just a few minutes, but there have to be scaffolds or accommodations so that children learn more efficiently and more effectively. Culturally rich curriculum, of course, we've talked about. Engagement, cooperative learning, and school-wide positive behavioral supports. You can learn much more about these topics and how to do this by watching the wonderful webinar presentations by Joe Ryan and by Dan Crimmins that were part of a school climate change and positive behavioral support series that preceded this one. Let's look at a couple of resources that I have in the packet for you that I think you and your teachers will enjoy. The first is actually an assessment tool. It's looking at the components of a culturally responsive classroom. There are 5 components here that we've chosen to highlight, and they are high expectations, supportive classroom environment, a culturally responsive curriculum, teacher as facilitator, and one of our favorite strategies that is really an easy one for teachers to implement is that of flexible grouping of their students in the classroom. This is a self-assessment, as I mentioned, that allows you and your teachers to look at the extent to which these practices are currently in place in a classroom. Now, the next document itself is actually a list of actions that teachers and leaders can take to increase the extent to which their classroom and their own actions are culturally responsive. I like this one because, as you can see, it's very practical, very, very simple, and it also leads to changes of practice. For example, teachers who are culturally responsive use materials and curriculum that reflect the students' backgrounds, etc. Well, that's a very interesting question when you go in many of our classrooms and look at the visuals around the room. They don't truly reflect the demographic characteristics of our school or our neighborhood. So one by one, teachers can work in their grade level groups or their subject area groups, and after having assessed on that first format, then begin to select the 1, 2, or 3 strategies that they'd like to begin to implement, and then return to it in periodic intervals so that they can add more strategies. I really like this list for a number of reasons, but I will say that if teachers can implement these and they are practical, you really should see a major increase or improvement in the environment and the climate of the school for all children. Now, those were 2 tools for you to look at for self-assessment and for action steps. But what I've done for us for the remainder of this component, I'm looking at changes in classroom practice, is to isolate 5 that I think would be the most helpful to discuss here in our seminar. What 5 desired characteristics, what 5 intentional acts do I need to put in place so that I improve my classroom characteristics for all children? The 5 are, as you can see from the visual, building authentic relationships. We'll talk about each one of these in detail. You couldn't escape second one, which is having higher teacher expectations for all children. The third one is very simple. It is increase the use of scaffolding and process skills among our students. I'm going to say parenthetically, increase the ease with which all children can learn. Many of our children are struggling to learn. It's a lot more difficult than it needs to be for them if we would simply provide them with some very simple scaffolds throughout the instruction. The fourth piece is a very powerful one, and it certainly relates to student behavior, and that is building student responsibility, self-responsibility for their own learning. We have a lot of dependent students, and so we're going to look at, dependent on the adult in the classroom, how we begin to build more independence and sense of self-efficacy. And then the fifth one is a pretty obvious one, looking at behavioral supports. But the take I'm going to use for this point when we get to the fifth characteristic is to suggest that we really have to remember to rely on what we already know how to do, and that is to use a functional behavioral assessment, to develop a positive behavioral plan of action for the student, and to remove the emotionality from it and really begin to look at the changes in the classroom instruction or the environment that would benefit the student. Let's look at this first one, building authentic relationships. And Certainly, this is one that is a very powerful strategy, but has varied responses. Elementary teachers usually respond, yes, of course, we love this, fun, we do it all the time, versus secondary faculty, even though they see the value of it, are often concerned in the how you do it, because they actually are developing relationships with 125 students or more per day. So let's look at some of the different tools that we have for you and how they might be used. The first one is Who I Am. It is a wonderful tool that I just simply got off the internet. If you'll notice, there are in these various blocks, and I encourage you to create your own, but one of the things that it's looking at here is not only your name, but your ethnicity, race, and culture, because it's respected and because it's important about you, what your hobbies are, something about your family, your birthday, your favorite food, music, TV, what have you. But I really also, if you'll look down to the bottom left of that, it also asks kids to describe the characteristics or qualities of a good teacher. What are the qualities of a good teacher, so that the teacher has an understanding of what that student values. It gives them a nice little visual or graphic to fill in, and they may do this over time. I leave it on their desk or in their materials, or the teacher may collect these and sit down with individual students and discuss them. But it's an excellent, very simple little strategy. The next two are related. They're cousins. They're the same idea of conducting a student interest survey. The first is for elementary level, and the second, of course, is for our secondary version. But I have to say the common emphasis in these two student interest surveys is finding out what kids like about school, what they find challenging, what strategies are helpful to them, and what the teacher can do to make learning more enjoyable and more effective and efficient for them. And so it really is a powerful set of questions that we really like, and that teachers can ask these in an interview format or over time in small groups or however they'd like to, so it can become manageable. But teachers report, and this is the important thing, that by using these student interest surveys, they have a whole different level of knowledge and appreciation for their students, because they know the answers to some of these really intriguing questions about their students' individual approach to school and issues that may be of impact in the home. So these are really nice tools. Another one that we have is this list here of strategies for building that culturally responsive or inclusive classroom environment. And I really like this with our use with teachers. Everything from inviting community members to speak to the class about issues in their community to writing about family traditions. This is getting more at the heart of some of the challenges that we face in disproportionately identifying children of color as in need of special education services. So this is getting much closer to the building of a culturally responsive classroom. This is a similar kind of a tool that has some really wonderful ideas for both authentic relationships with students and with the families. That was a lot of tools in a hurry. I guess our concept here is that we don't need to make things really challenging for teachers. There are an awful lot of very simple ways to have them begin to use a particular strategy, and then I truly believe that sometimes attitudes change after we have given our teachers or ourselves some practical tools to use, so that if I begin to feel more competent and confident in my skills, I really see some of the more complex attitudes that will change after the practical versus before. So in looking at the second characteristic of high teacher expectations, the point I'd like to make here is for teachers to, when they're diving deeply into their own level of cultural proficiency, to really examine their own attitudes. This was quite an interesting study that was just completed by the Center for American Progress, and you can find this on any website that you'd like, but it's a troubling study in that they surveyed teachers across the board and found that there was a bias that children of color would be less likely than their white peers to achieve a college degree. So if you have that assumption while you're teaching these students, How might you be giving off messages or changing your own approaches with children that actually make this bias a reality in our community? It's a difficult conversation to have with ourselves. Questioning yourself and then looking at the other options, the options that we have for beginning to communicate higher expectations. I love the schools that I go in where the teacher actually puts information about the college they attended, pictures from their college, information about their college, and tries to encourage every one of their students to go to the school they attended. It's kind of a cute, interesting rivalry, a happy rivalry across the faculty, but it communicates phenomenal messages to youngsters that are very powerful. Again, if we can change the practice, we can change the attitude. The third piece is one that I'll have to discipline myself because I often want to spend longer on it than I should because I think it is so powerful. The use of scaffolds or instructional accommodations to make learning easier for students. I have to admit that in all of our hundreds of classroom observations that we conduct every year in our firm, one of the most troubling is that we are still not seeing the very creative and powerful use of accommodations. I'll call them accommodations or scaffolding in the classroom. Graphic organizers, word banks, task lists, what have you, a timer for completing a task that are very powerful for students. Yet you see everyone performing the same activity with the same level of expectation and in the same manner. That just defies what we know about good teaching and learning. So getting into the scaffolding content, I think one thing we want to remind our teachers that really matters to most of us, certainly with all of our increased accountability and our concern over the levels at which our students are actually achieving and our fast pacing within our curriculum guide, is that we stay within the learner objective. We don't go outside of the learner objective. That's our focus. But that we build scaffolds to make it easier for the student to achieve that objective. We're not watering down the objective. We're not changing it. But we're making it easier to achieve that on-grade level or beyond learner objective. To that end, we have provided you with some very simple tools to use with your teachers. There's a list or types of scaffolds, definitions of those that can be used in the classroom. We also have some one-pagers for you. You can distribute either one at a time or as a group, and perhaps ask your department chairs or your grade level chairs to engage in some kind of study with each of these and look at, are they currently using graphic organizers, for example? To what extent are they using them? When do they use them? What difficulties are they having in using them? And what are they teaching the students in terms of developing their own graphic organizers so they've really reached their own level of independence? So we, as you see, have visual schedules. We have several other tools in your packet for you. This is one of my favorite tools, and I've begun to think that this is perhaps what we're doing wrong in trying to promote the use of accommodations. I discovered recently that what I've been doing is what I just did in the last minute. I have been describing individual accommodations or scaffolds. I think what I've been doing wrong then is, wouldn't it have been smarter, would it be smarter for us in our schools to talk about the area of difficulty the child may be experiencing and then provide a list of the accommodations and scaffolds that would really be more targeted to those areas of concern. So in this little format, and it's several pages long, we're just going to show you one of the pages, I think this is the way for us to go. I think it's going to help make a lot more sense out of the accommodations we're trying to promote. If the child has, for example, a difficulty becoming interested in the task or completing the task on time, or drawing conclusions and making inferences, to the right of that area of difficulty are a number of very good practical suggestions. So I'm thinking, frankly, of redoing a lot of what I've been doing over the last several years and recategorizing the ideas about accommodations and scaffolding to fit under more of a diagnostic approach of what the student is having difficulty with. Therefore, what accommodation should I select? Or what are some of the options I can consider? So I think you'll enjoy that tool. This next one was sort of an aha for me some years ago. I was working with a low-performing high school, very concerned about their student performance scores, and a really discouraged group. And we kept peeling the onion, if you will, to say, what could we change? What could we do differently? And suddenly it occurred within the group that we didn't really have a lot of confidence that the students possessed the process skills in order to learn the content. Maybe it wasn't the difficulty of learning the content itself. Maybe I didn't know how to study. Maybe I didn't know how to pull reference materials together. Maybe I didn't know how to prepare for my homework assignment, get it home actually and actually complete it. We ask teachers to think first, not only are what you're teaching, but this is a great set of questions that are on the screen now. What process skills do students need in order to be successful in this grade or subjects? Do our students possess them? And have we actually explicitly taught them? Have we taught them the skills of note-taking? Now, one of the things that I have on the screen now for you is a kind of a nifty little format that shows an example of what our teachers can then do, given what the content and grade level they're teaching, to identify the specific process skills needed at their grade level. Ideally, in my mind, they would share it with the grade level before theirs. If these skills are needed in the 6th grade, I'd want to share them with the 5th grade teachers, and so on and so forth. But to list the process skills needed, and then to determine the extent to which our students actually have these skills. If you remember the old ad when the person kind of bonked their head and said, wow, I could have had a V8, is it possible that we are struggling in terms of our children learning the content, and we're focused so on that we've forgotten to pay attention to their process skills? So that's the conclusion of that 4th piece. And then very quickly, what I mentioned to you earlier as I laid out these 5 was the 5th one, which is looking at positive behavioral supports, is nothing more than actually sharpening our skills at what we already know how to do. And that is looking at positive behavioral supports that are explicitly taught. We certainly heard a lot of terrific advice about positive behavioral supports during the 3-part webinar series that preceded this one. It was about school climate change and making real changes for positive behavior. So I encourage you to watch those 3 recordings if you were not able to attend. What I wanted to do here is we're going to take a little left turn, I guess, and that's to say this ties back to the cultural competence of the teacher in the classroom by looking at the teacher and looking at the behavioral standards in his or her classroom. What for that teacher are acceptable behavioral norms in the classroom? Acceptable, for example, levels of noise, or the physicality in the classroom, kids moving around. Are they given freedom? Are they told to keep their feet flat on the floor? The importance of allowing students to direct some of their instruction rather than it be fully adult-directed. So when we start looking at behavior, are we truly identifying behavioral issues that are concerns, that are relevant, that are important for us to address for the child proactively and preventatively? Or are we actually looking at some of the issues that just get on our last nerve and that are not really appropriate for creating the referrals and the hoping the child leaves the classroom and all of that spiral, which we're about to talk about next, the classroom to prison pipeline? So just look at this list. I think it's very powerful to say how much is my own attitude and my own cultural background impacting my view of acceptable behavior in my classroom. What we want to begin now is thinking about what we do to eliminate or to adjust or substitute the inappropriate behavior. Are our referrals designed for us to eliminate the child from the classroom? Are they designed to send them further down the hall? Are they designed to have us look for another adult who will be responsible for this child and his behavior? Or are our in-classroom behaviors as teachers and principals designed for us to actually apply a really good problem-solving process that's objective and student-centered, that has a very good chance of eliminating or changing those inappropriate behaviors? Are we putting the burden on the child, or are we putting the burden on the system? The study that came from Texas some 10, 12 years ago that almost everyone has read about is called the Cradle to Prison Pipeline. And I think that this has, at least for me, been a career-changing or life-changing, perspective-changing study. And I would hope that as leaders, we make certain that everyone has not only read the original study, but there's been a recent update with new statistics in the Cradle to Prison pipeline. But our notion here is very much articulated by the Association of Black School Psychologists. Overrepresentation of minority children, and I'll just paraphrase, is a civil rights violation and is a major contributor to that school to prison pipeline. And notice the phrases here that follow that match the 5 characteristics that we just discussed. Low teacher expectations, yielding the low quality of instruction, which then leads to low quality education. I think you can hear several of the 5 listed in that wonderful phrase there. We're just reminding ourselves that we have functional behavioral analysis that ask important questions that need to be answered, and we need to remove the adult feelings and attitudes and the personalization from it and bring it much more down to understanding the child and knowing where to intervene. Let's now move then to component 3. We've looked at what we could do in changes in terms of classroom practices, and certainly before that we looked at changes in attitudes. And now we're ready to look at changes in leadership and systems. And this is our last component, I think, because it's sort of a sacred responsibility as we view it as leaders. What is our responsibility for protecting children and providing them with equitable and quality services? So what does that mean for me as an educator? And certainly one of the things that we'll use a quote from Heifetz and Linsky, mobilizing people to make progress on the hardest of problems. And I would say that what this really does requires courage. So what does it require from leadership? Certainly that courage, but we have to be willing to state some non-negotiables. We have to be willing to say to our faculty, it is a non-negotiable that we all serve all students, that we work to provide for each student what they require in order to be successful, that we're going to be culturally proficient as a faculty, and we're going to call each other out if we are not. It's also going to ask us to have a heightened attention to the referrals, where they come from, who they come from, and what issues are typically embedded in those referrals. And does that, in fact, instead of reflecting characteristics of the students in the classroom, do those referrals reflect instead a need for additional and more aggressive professional development? The conclusion of this third piece for me is there are some things that individual teachers by themselves cannot address, cannot change, or in some cases individual schools on their own cannot, and that there has to be a system at the district level. But certainly one of those is intensive professional development about cultural bias and privilege and prejudice and the opportunity for people to have very courageous conversations. Otherwise, we're not scratching the surface. The other is to, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I guess I've seen instances of the need for this quite recently, and that is to address individuals and or small groups directly when their attitudes or behavior is counter to the expectations that we have for culturally proficient educators. We have to sit down and say, what's at work here? This is what I'm noticing. These are the behaviors. These are the referrals. These are the comments that do not match that of a culturally proficient educator. Again, we need to study our referral data, as we mentioned earlier, and then we also need to provide more consistency in the supports that we provide to the teacher, to the classroom, and to the student around behavioral issues. I'm often in a school discussing with teachers a behavioral concern, and they noted that they'd worked on 3 occasions with John, the behavioral specialist, and when we had a real meltdown in the classroom with that individual student and really needed John, the system wasn't set up that way, and Mary was the one that was sent as a behavioral specialist instead, not knowing the student, not having the history. So we need to look at smaller communities of service options so that we have consistent service providers. And then I think a debriefing process that enables educators to explore their successes. I do think that we have a number of educators who are doing such beautiful work, And I think that we need to begin using them as examples, citing them, recognizing them, showing some reward for the kinds of initiative and clarity they have around their own cultural proficiency practices in the classroom. The systems issues that need to be in place, I think, are really critical because individuals by themselves cannot address all of the challenges and the opportunities that we have for improving education. As we close then today, we've looked at attitude changes in awareness and attitudes, the classroom, and leadership and systems. And finally, a systems process that we need, I think, to put in place is the expectation that all of us are continuously growing and increasing our ownership for all students. Periodically, a debriefing for the faculty or individual faculty members that talk about their successes and perhaps remaining challenges in addressing inclusive services, providing inclusive services within the context of successfully addressing behavioral concerns so that we're not excluding more of our children, but rather more successful including in a myriad of ways. So in closing then, I'll just remind all of our audience that it's been, for me, a real privilege to present to you. And I'll end with a phrase I've used already once in this seminar series, but it's sort of a mantra for myself. And we have to remember, particularly in this topic, that the burden is not on the child, it's on the system. And thank you for participating. And now, I see that we have hundreds of questions that have been coming in. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Clay for us to start unpacking as many of those as our time today permits.
Thank you, Frances. The burden is not on the child, it's on the system. Just so much in there that you shared with us, and we all appreciate it so much. And we're very glad to have you back in this webinar series. So as you said, the questions have been pouring in, tons of interest here, so let's get right to them. Here's the first one. What criteria could indicate that a special needs student is better supported in an all-day segregated program or would be better supported in an inclusion model? Is there research that shows when it is most appropriate to keep a learner in the self-contained setting?
Well, that's a great question, and it also reveals a wish to have real clear answers so that our jobs are not as challenging as they truly are, because we all know there really isn't a single criteria. In fact, it's to the child's advantage, and here's why. I will remind us all that every decision we make in this arena must be individually determined. And that, a couple of other things that we must remember, that the general ed classroom is the first consideration. And that we only move beyond it to the extent that it's appropriate for the student. So the first thing is, have we exhausted our options and strategies inside the general ed classroom with instructional, behavioral, or personal support to make that a successful environment? But if we look at the needs of the student and we identify that there are one or more goals that while we could meet them in the general class, because we could pull the youngster off to the back of the room and provide the teacher in the back at a single table, that really isn't a reflection of inclusion either, because we have to admit that for some students that we need some time, that will need some time outside of the general ed classroom. So let's begin looking at first, have we done our role within our job and considering the general ed classroom? And then the second piece is, if we have youngsters leave that general ed classroom, are they going for something, an intervention that's actually worth that time? Is it very focused? Is it very specific? Is it not remedial in nature, but is it something that's designed to really help the student stay as close to the curriculum framework as possible for the district? So it's a really great question. It does reflect, I think, the increasing diversity of youngsters and their needs when they come into the school, but you cannot move away from the standard of what could we do first in the general class. And then I will say this as for an instructional strategy. I think we need to do a really careful job of training all of our teachers in how to look at the on-grade level standard-based learner objective that we're working toward, and then ask ourselves, is it possible for us to work on a learner objective that may be 2 or 3 grade levels below, but could be accomplished in that same activity with just some flexibility on the part of the teacher and the student. So we want to do everything we can to make it appropriate, but honestly, if a child needs some help outside of the general ed class, and these skills and goals and strategies or methodologies are just not compatible at this point inside the general ed class, then we need to feel good that we have made that decision on the basis of what that individual child needs and proceed.
Fantastic. That's a very helpful answer. When thinking of at-risk students, is there something that stands out to you as to why students of color are more likely to be at risk?
Well, I think the piece that we talked about earlier on cultural proficiency and white privilege is very helpful in answering that question. And I really want to make the point very clear and upfront is that the difficulty that a child of color may be experiencing in school is not related to some inherent limitation in his race, culture, language. It is related actually to, I think, a different access to level of access and opportunity. And over time, the cumulative effects of differential access to resources can really show up in the student's performance. And so, it's not the child. It's the cultural. The accumulation of the cultural limitations of access that do impact these youngsters, and we need to make them up.
Great. What's the most important thing that we can do to reduce instances of inappropriate identification of minority students for special ed services?
Well, I've been speaking a great deal recently to principals about this subject, and one of the things that I would say is that first we want to be careful that the teachers have had the information they need. Do they understand cultural proficiency and white privilege? The most important thing, I think, is do individual teachers understand that if they have a negative or biased attitude toward youngsters, then that's not a secret from the children in the classroom, and that children are quite sensitive to that and read that teacher like a book and feel that sense of dislike or rejection from their teacher. And so one of the things we have to be careful and do is make sure that our teachers have that training. But the other thing I'd add to that is we've got to really keep our data and watch it, and we need to drill down. For example, are there particular teachers or grade levels where the over-referrals for minority youngsters are occurring? And if that's the case, then what we need to do then is pull individual teachers into some coaching, into some honest conversation about their referral patterns and what the reasons may be, what support they need to change those practices. So I think it's finally we're down to the point where you have to call it out. You have to say what's happening here and what's happening in your classroom, and maybe what are the preconceived notions you may have that are leading to these referrals that truly are not representative of student needs.
Let's talk about behavior for a little bit. Here's a new question for you. Behavior seems to be our largest barrier to inclusion. How can our teachers become more responsive in the ever-growing world of accountability?
Well, I hear that. I see that concern. I agree with that concern about behavior. One of the things that I think we have to take ourselves back to is what are the bedrock practices that should occur in our schools that should be in place that mediate or modify the incidences and the level of severity of behaviors. And I'm going to just mention a couple. One is school-wide positive behavioral supports need to be in place in every school. I still go in many schools where there are totally different behavioral rules for classroom to classroom. There might not be any behavioral rules in the cafeteria, but there are in the hallway. And so positive behavioral supports has been around a long time, but I don't see us implementing it with fidelity in our schools, and that's a basic. And then one of the things that we have to be careful of is, have we made assumptions that our students arrive at school already knowing those school behaviors, the ones that our teachers expect of us? And very often the answer is no. And so we need to identify very specifically and measurably the behaviors that we expect in the classrooms, and then we need to explicitly teach those. And so I think those are two things that are critical. But I have to say, when I smiled when I saw the phrase attached to the end of this question, said, with the ever-growing world of accountability. Boy, you talk about a direct connection. There is a direct connection between behavioral issues in a classroom and the quality of instruction and the quality of student engagement, which of course is are our measures for accountability. So the better the instruction, the better the behavior.
What can be done to change the mindset of regular educators that kids who are in special education should be segregated from the general education classroom?
Well, first of all, I think all educators want what's good for children. I think they want what's right for children. And I think part of it is that we're looking at some of the implementation hurdles when we're somewhat reluctant or resistant to more inclusive practices. Basically, too, we're changing core beliefs, and we have to admit that that takes time. But if I were to say any one thing over all these years, I would say that often our general ed teachers are not given opportunities unless we create them to develop authentic, real, meaningful relationships with children with disabilities. So we need to create those opportunities because we need to begin to see all of our youngsters as individuals and with personalities and with interests and likes and needs. And when teachers begin to develop that relationship with those youngsters that they may have thought, ooh, I didn't have any training in that, I didn't get my degree in special ed, but when they develop those relationships, one of the quickest things that changes is then the attitude about the importance and the need to include them in the general ed classroom within the general curriculum. So I think that's really one of the more important pieces, is recognizing that our teachers really want what's right for kids, but we just have to increase our comfort zone with diversity in the classroom.
Okay. How can we ensure that students are prepared for job interviews, the workplace, and upward mobility when there may be social stigmas against the way they speak in cases where their language reflects their culture and not standard American English?
Well, I was looking during this session, and so one of the questions that came through, and I'd like to read it real quickly. It said, as a speech-language pathologist working on deficits in syntax, semantics, and morphology with my students, is it appropriate to teach the students how to adjust or switch their oral formulation of language to the audience to which they are speaking? Many of my students will share that they speak one way in the hood and differently when, for example, they're presenting to class. And I think that's the beautiful answer. There are 2, maybe even 3 languages, and we don't want to denigrate any at all the language that's spoken in the home and in the neighborhood and with friends. But I think what we have to do is allow for that. But certainly, I mean, that's part of the culture. But then to also speak of the different language that's used in the workplace and in the classroom and in the community.
Is inclusion appropriate at any age level, even preschool? Is there evidence that this works?
Oh, absolutely. You know, one of the phrases I love to use in my training is we're no longer arguing should we include youngsters or why should we include youngsters in schools to the extent that it's appropriate to their needs. The questions now are just how do we get it done and how do we do it well. And so absolutely exclamation mark right behind that. If I could, I'd like to add a point. There are a number of really good questions that have come over online about the resources that we provided. And there are several pages to that instrument if the student is experiencing difficulty. So we'll make sure that you'll be able to get those, the full document, and all of the tools. Some of you mentioned that the type or font changes to numbers somewhere in the midst. So I know I hope I'm not throwing a curve to you folks but, that are producing this, but maybe we could, if the participants would consider downloading the materials again, if there are any glitches with them, perhaps we can fix those, and we'll make sure that they get the full set of if the student is experiencing difficulty. These are some strategies for addressing them.
Okay.
Would that be possible?
Yes, of course. We will get that out to everyone and make sure that everything is included there. And we're getting some more questions coming in here that I'd love to include as well, Frances. So the first question is, in a perfect world, they're kind of setting you up here, I got to say, but it's a good question. In a perfect world, what would special education services look like? And the follow-up is, do you think what you describe is possible?
Oh, okay. Well, let's even take out the word perfect. Let's just say in a world in which we're following quality, research-based practices that are backed up by promises of equity and excellence for all children, that those practices are actually very clear for us. And one of the sites you might refer to as the Inclusive Schools Network has a number of downloadables that have those quality standards. But I would say that I do see these in place, but I do see wonderful educators working toward this every day. But in total candor, I'm going to say this is one of the most challenging things that we're doing in schools. I think it takes every ounce of our creativity and commitment to children. I do believe that we're already seeing changes. I know I am, and seeing changes in practice and commitment. Principals sitting with faculty and really looking at individual student needs. Faculties assessing their quality of their practices. But I do believe it will be a reality, but I think one of the things that this seminar has spoken to is that importance of shifting that core belief system in order to get those strategies in place. And if I don't want to, or I don't value inclusion, or if I just inherently believe that some children just shouldn't have access to opportunities to be with their peers, even at a social level, then my willingness and ability to implement what are just basically great, good teaching practices is diminished. And so I think, excellent question. It was predicted years ago that the least restrictive environment or inclusion piece of the original legislation for children with disabilities was going to be the most difficult one to implement, and that's certainly been true. But I see it happening every day.
Well, let's follow up on that legislative thread, because we have another question here. They want to know what you think the new impact will be of ESSA.
Well, I just left a meeting about that this morning, and certainly the thing that I think is obvious is that more latitude is given back to states and to school districts about the accountability measures and the time frames. And actually, I am pleased with that simply because I'm not liking the level of tension and stress and people leaving the field, because I do think that as much as I supported No Child Left Behind, I also worried about some fairly tough and arbitrary standards that were really very difficult for folks to meet. So I hope that we'll all calm down a little bit, that we'll really focus on the work to do that's quality. But the thing that I love is about ESSA is that it does not take away our accountability to close the achievement gap for all children. And so we're still accountable for good teaching and good practice and being inclusive and all of those practices that we've come to understand through the previous accountability system. But it does give us a little bit of I think, belief that that we're not asked to meet certain standards within timelines that are simply, for some of our states and some of our districts, the timelines were just impossible. But I'm so pleased that it does not remove any part of being accountable for closing that achievement gap for at-risk children.
Great. We've got time for one more question here. One of our listeners wants to know, is disproportionality a regional issue, or is it a concern across the entire U.S.?
It's a concern across the entire United States. Now, I have not looked at a state-by-state analysis, but I would urge you to access the latest, you can look for it by the annual report to Congress on IDEA, or for Individuals with Disabilities Act, and access their annual report, and it reports it by state. And
yeah, I would echo that. There's so much good data online for IDEA.
Fabulous, and it'll give you that. But honestly, it's a nationwide concern.
Wonderful. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. We have to break a little bit early because there is a quiz for our listeners, and I'll be giving out more detailed information on that. You need to complete the quiz to get your credits in most cases, so please stay tuned for that. But thank you again, Frances. Literally, the questions are still coming in, and we just so appreciated having you on today and your great advice and your great encouragement here. To those of you listening, if you are considering a new phase in your career, or if you know someone who would be interested in working from home on their own schedule, Presence is seeking the very best SLPs, OTs, school psychologists, and social workers. Check out our website for more information. I really appreciate your participation today, and here's some more information on what is next in this webinar. This webinar is the first of our three-part 2016 Winter-Spring series, Success for Every Learner. The response so far has been amazing, so if you haven't already done so, be sure to register for an outstanding presentation by Dr. Ed Dunkelblau, one of the originators of the social emotional learning movement. Finally, one more thank you for participating to all of you out there. All of us at Presence Learning are committed to unlocking the potential of every child and providing you with world-class professional development. For more information or to see a live demo of Presence Learning's online special education and related services, including online delivery of speech therapy, occupational therapy, and behavioral mental health services, email us at schools@presencelearning.com.